And hello, I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to class. So, for this particular screencast, I'd like to take a moment to explore the two articles that we looked at in week number 2. The two articles, one was a prevalence study and one was an incidence study. And so, just trying to show some examples. Now, I had a professor one time say that all research is good, but potentially all research has limitations to it. And I think that's true, especially when you take a look at some of these articles that we're going to explore here. The first one here, it's a prevalence study. It says it right in the title. So, looking at the prevalence and treatment of hypertension in two populations in the United States, masters swimmers versus the NHA-NES population, and that's defined later in the article. So the NHA-NES population was a cohort that answered questions related to the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And so what the authors chose to do here is they chose to compare the prevalence of hypertension in adult masters swimmers with those who completed that 2008 survey. And they describe the characteristics of the population here in the abstract as well as within the article. And then they go on to present their findings. And I imagine you could, just by looking at the title here, have a potential guess who's going to be better, the general population or individuals who are physically active. So this is kind of an interesting study. And the reason I say it's interesting is, why do it? If it's something that, so when you do something, you're trying to answer a research question. So I think they go into something here where they talk about, maybe it's here, yes. So they write, since prior investigations of the prevalence of hypertension has not been conducted in masters swimmers, our null hypothesis is that the prevalence of individuals suffering from hypertension in the USMS population, so the United States masters swimmers, would not differ from that in the NHA-NES population. So, of course, the null hypothesis being the one that you don't think is going to occur, obviously, they're going to be thinking the alternative or alternate hypothesis that those master swimmers would have a significantly different blood pressure. And they then list some of the additional hypotheses there related to potential medication use. Now, I think what's nice about these articles that I'm sharing is that they are kind of illustrating for you the ways that researchers present their case for a particular study. And I've talked about that. And again, another way, let's talk about it again. When you think the introduction, in this particular case, they might talk about hypertension being something that is a major problem for the population and what hypertension does, what it can cause, et cetera, et cetera. And then they might present some statistics, known statistics about hypertension rates in the United States, and that hypertension is treated by medications in order to decrease blood pressure. And they might also talk generally about what is known about exercise and its effects on blood pressure. So they're starting to build that case, finishing up within the purpose of this study paragraph, usually the last paragraph in the introduction section, where they are going, in this particular case, they talk about the prevalence of hypertension not being known. And so they are going into then, this is the purpose of this study, and these are our hypotheses. Continuing on, it's nice to see how people write up their data analysis or statistical analysis section, and to, again, think about the different statistical tests that are used. I know you're doing coursework in biostatistics, and so seeing those examples applied in the research article, I think really helps. The more you consume that and think about those things, the easier some of those more challenging ones, the easier they become. Now, I think a key feature of epidemiologic studies is the tables, and this is a nice table here. And what's really interesting is this is just the characteristics or the demographics of individuals. And when you're making comparisons, one is apples and one is oranges. So you're looking at those differences there. You've got basically one race representing the masters swimmers. You have higher education status or education attainment in the master swimmers, and better health status as well as time exercising in the past 30 days. So both groups, they aren't the same. And so that kind of gets back to again, why would they do this study? Here's a table where they're presenting the prescriptions. And so those people who need antihypertensive medications, we see those differences between groups. So what could be the purpose of a study like this? So for one, as we talked about last week, a prevalence study is not going to show causation. So what's the purpose of something like this? From the outset, you might go, well, it's kind of a no duh. People that are exercising a lot, people that have higher educational attainment, maybe are making more money, maybe they've got better resources for better food choices, maybe those with higher education may think differently about their diet and health. It's kind of like a no duh type of study. But you never want to put judgment towards something, and so I'm trying to be careful not to express that. It may sound like I'm being judgmental. So maybe what the authors were doing was trying to illustrate that BP is better in the swimmers population in order to do a justification to do a different study. So sometimes you need to have a starting point, some building blocks. And so you can't go 2 steps forward without taking a small baby step forward. So maybe they'd like to do like an 8-week swim fitness type of class to investigate changes in blood pressure and do so in individuals that aren't currently exercising. But if they were trying to go for some sort of grant, maybe they felt like they needed to have justification for it, evidence that shows that it could be beneficial. So I tried looking up to see if Guthrie and Erickson had done any other work in this area, to see if they had explored the benefits of swimming on blood pressure. And I couldn't find anything. What I did find from them was another prevalence study. And so looking at master swimmers using more dietary supplements than individuals in a large national comparison population in the United States. So it looks like what they were doing is they had access to some data sets, and then using those data sets, they were able to answer some questions. And so on one hand, I'm jealous that they had access to these great data sets. Because if you ever work in a situation where you're able to get access to 10,000, 20,000 data points, you can really do some cool stuff. Now, what is the evidence for aquatic exercise and blood pressure? Well, that work has been done. And so it appears to be beneficial. but it wasn't done by our previous authors. Now let's talk about this one, incidents and causes of sudden death in U.S. college athletes. Now this one is really interesting and sometimes is controversial in the class. And I think it's controversial, especially for those people who work in sports medicine or athletic training, because when you think about sudden death of a young individual, that's traumatic or tragic and in and of itself. But then we also think about, wow, an athletic individual, somebody that we think about being at peak health, peak fitness, and them succumbing to something like that. It's just, I think, overwhelming for us to think about. And we want to be able to do something to address that. Well, people will talk about that all the time. Let's do something. Let's do something. But then the question is, what can be done? And if we do things, are we going to be able to identify people? See, that's a big thing with epidemiology is, can we identify people who are at risk for something, and can we intervene to reduce that risk? So in this case, could we identify people who are at risk for sudden death and intervene? And at the same time, not potentially exclude people from sport who could benefit from participation, because that's always the flip side. Could have a false positive, and so now you're telling somebody, oh no, you have something wrong with you. What kind of stress does that put upon somebody that maybe they shouldn't be physically active or active at a level that they'd like to be? So now what's good about this article is, again, they talk about what the purpose of their study is. So I think this is a great kind of intro here, talking about what sudden death is, how it's catastrophic, presenting rates, looking at the rates of death, and then getting into how they're going to answer their particular question. Now, their methodology is really rich, and they do a nice job of explaining all the different ways that they tried to find information about sudden death during athletics. So I think they did a nice job there. And then because there were so many different sources, it made for a nice table. Again, in epidemiologic studies, they can be very dense with data. And so if you can create tables and figures that bring things to life, I think that's really beneficial. Excellent table here, characteristics and causes of death in 182 NCAA student athletes. And it's really interesting to see the number per the different categories. Again, all the deaths are tragic and unfortunate, but you start to get an appreciation for things that are considered cardiovascular deaths versus trauma versus drowning versus other things like suicide and drugs. Nice figure here, kind of breaking things down from there. And then within the confirmed cardiovascular deaths, getting a look at the different diagnoses. So that brings things to life. How do you, for example, screen somebody for an aortic rupture? Mortality rates. So presenting things. And I think what they're trying to do here is illustrate, okay, here were the mortality rates comparing the NCAA athletes versus the general population, and illustrating that there were significant differences with athletes being at a much lower rate than the general population. And we see that too then when they go down and take a look at comparisons between populations based upon race. African American NCAA athletes, looking at their rates compared to the general population of African Americans, and then looking at Caucasians, looking at the athletes and their rates compared to the general population. And another great figure here to illustrate causes of death, because they're trying to put into perspective, and this is what's really valuable about epidemiologic studies. If we have limited time and limited resources, where should we put our limited time and resources to have the biggest effect? So we see that there were 76 U.S. NCAA athletes that passed due to cardiovascular disease. But take a look at then other causes. So they concluded that the student athletes don't seem to be at a unique or particularly high risk for sudden death due to unsuspected cardiovascular disease. And they go on to suggest that the relative importance of suicide and drug deaths reported with respect to the health and safety of college athletes suggests that there may be a disproportionate focus on cardiovascular disease in the population. So they're then making an argument maybe there should be more done to focus public health efforts towards reducing death due to those causes. What were your thoughts? Controversial, not controversial? It's interesting, regardless. I want to share a couple of examples from my work. So this is something published in Research in Sports Medicine, looking at the prevalence of patellar tendon abnormalities. So at baseline, when people at the start of the season, we did ultrasound imaging, what was the prevalence of an abnormal looking tendon on ultrasound? And then following people into the future for incidence of patellar tendinopathy. So in this case, we looked at both things. Now, we didn't look at period prevalence. We didn't call it that. We were looking at two different things. Abnormality, so people being basically asymptomatic, but with an abnormal looking tendon, and then those who go on to develop tendinopathy. And so, again, within the particular paper, there are these demographic things that you want to include and other tables like that to bring things to life. So what you can see from a table like this is there were 22 out of the 106 individuals that presented with patellar tendon abnormality at the start of the season. Now, I can tell you that patellar tendon abnormality did not increase the risk of somebody developing symptomatic patellar tendinopathy. I don't have those pictures in here, but that's a way that you can get kind of both prevalence and incidence, ways of thinking about doing both within the same study. Another incidence example, looking at jump and hop measures, so broad jump and single leg hop for distance in male collegiate basketball players. And so what I'm reporting here are injury rates. And this doesn't really have anything to do with the jump and hop distance. I looked at jump and hop distance as potential risk factors, and they weren't risk factors for male collegiate level basketball players. But what I did report in this area was I was curious if there was differences in injury rates between starters and non-starters. You might think, oh, starters play more, they're going to be hurt more. Well, as it turned out, this was looking at just that, and there was no difference in injury rates. And then down below, looking at injury rates between guards and forwards. And again, found no difference in injury rates there. Now, you've done your discussion one topic. Remember, by the 19th, I want you to respond to classmates. So the ones I've seen so far look really great, the prevalence and incidence. So you're getting it. You're getting a good idea on the difference between prevalence and incidence. So nice work on that. Here's some examples of some different studies that people have created in this class. And I tried to show some illustrations of a variety of different things, whether they come from neuro world, pediatric world, sports medicine, orthopedics, and even in the registered dietitian world. All right, this was kind of an interesting study. It was part of this dissertation. I think he's getting ready to submit papers now. So this individual has been an athletic trainer for the national fencing competitions. And there just really isn't data out there. And so he is able to, because of his work, do some epidemiologic studies and identify the injury rates in elite fencers. So, you know, there could be great opportunities for you to do things. And again, at any time, if you want to talk about stuff, I look forward to doing that with you.